Every woman knows the pain of being told her life isn't her own, the ache of watching others decide your future while you smile and nod. Elira felt that ache every day until she finally walked away from the arranged marriage that would have made her a political pawn. Now she builds her cabin alone, one log at a time, her hands raw but her heart free. What she doesn't know is that King Ronan watches from the forest each morning. He has ruled through strength and commanded through power. But this woman's quiet determination stirs something forgotten in him. He could take anything he wanted, but for the first time in his life, he finds himself wanting something that can only be freely given. What happens when a king learns that the heart cannot be conquered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like a gentle embrace as Elira hefted another log into position. Her father's axe felt familiar in her calloused hands, the same hands that once held delicate teacups and signed marriage contracts she never wanted. 3 months had passed since she'd fled the capital in the dead of night, leaving behind silk gowns and gilded cages for rough wool and honest labor. The borderlands suited her in ways the royal court never had. Here, where the kingdom's manicured estates gave way to wild forests and rolling meadows, she could breathe without wondering who might be listening. The air smelled of pine and possibility, not perfume and political scheming. Her small plot of land, purchased with the jewelry she'd managed to smuggle out, sat in a natural clearing where an old homestead had once stood. The previous foundation. Stones remained, solid and true, waiting for someone with vision to build upon them again. Elira had learned woodworking from her father during stolen summer afternoons, when her tutors thought she was practicing embroidery. Lord Marcus had been a gentle soul who understood his daughter's restless spirit, even if he couldn't protect her from the marriage alliances that noble blood demanded. His tools had been the last things she'd taken from her old life, a set of well-maintained chisels, planes, and measuring squares that spoke of craftsmanship and patience. "Take your time with the foundation," he'd always said, his weathered hands guiding hers along the wood grain. "Rush the beginning, and everything that follows will be crooked." She wished he could see her now, though the ache of his absence still caught her by surprise sometimes. He'd died 2 winters past, leaving her truly alone with a stepmother who saw her only as a valuable asset to be traded. The memory of Lady Cordelia's cold calculation still made Elira's jaw clench. "Your father's sentimentality dies with him," she'd said the morning after the funeral. "Lord Brennan's son will make you a fine husband, and his father's lands will strengthen our position against the northern threats." The arranged engagement had been announced before Elira could protest. Lord Brennan's son, Garrett, was 20, years her senior, with hands that wandered and a laugh that never reached his eyes. She'd endured 3 formal dinners before realizing she had a choice, a terrifying, liberating choice that her father's quiet rebellion had taught her to recognize. So she'd chosen freedom over security, calloused hands over soft ones, and the curse, honest ache of physical labor over the suffocating weight of expectations. The cabin was taking shape slowly but surely. She'd spent the first month just clearing the land and preparing materials, learning to fell trees and strip bark with methods half remembered from childhood visits to her father's carpenter friends. Her body had protested initially, muscles, unused to such work, skin soft from a life of privilege, but she'd welcomed the transformation. Each blister was proof of her independence, each sore muscle a testament to her determination. The villagers in Millhaven, an hour's walk through. The forest had been kind but cautious. News traveled slowly to the borderlands, but it traveled nonetheless. They knew a noble lady had taken up residence in the old Thornfield clearing, though none had dared ask too many questions. Old Henrik, who ran the general store, had been particularly helpful, extending credit for supplies and offering advice on local weather patterns. "Winter comes early here," he'd warned, his weathered face creased with concern. "You'll want that roof finished before the first snow, and that's sooner than you might think." His wife, Marta, had been more direct. "A woman alone needs friends," she'd said, pressing a jar of preserves into Elira's hands. "Don't be too proud to ask for help when you need it." Elira appreciated their concern, but she'd grown to treasure her solitude. The silence of the forest, broken only by birdsong and the whisper of wind through leaves, felt more peaceful than any palace hall. Her days had developed a rhythm that satisfied something deep in her soul, rising with the sun, working until her body demanded rest, falling asleep to the sounds of night creatures instead of court gossip. What she hadn't expected was the feeling of being watched. It had started in her second week. A prickling awareness between her shoulder blades, the sense of eyes upon her as she worked. At first, she'd attributed it to her own paranoia, fear that Garrett or his father might have sent trackers to drag her back to her obligations. She'd scan the tree line carefully each morning, looking for signs of pursuit, but saw nothing beyond the usual forest dwellers. The feeling persisted, though it gradually lost its menacing edge. Whatever presence observed her seemed more curious than threatening. Sometimes she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow shifting between trees, the suggestion of a figure watching from the ridge above. But when she turned to look directly, nothing was there. She'd mentioned it to Marta during one of her supply runs to Millhaven. "Could be the wolves," the older woman had mused, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. "They're curious creatures, and they say there's been a large pack ranging through these parts lately. Nothing to fear if you don't threaten them, but they do like to observe." Wolves seemed an inadequate explanation for the intelligence Elira sensed in that distant scrutiny. This felt deliberate, thoughtful, almost protective. On the days when the watching presence felt strongest, she found herself working with increased confidence, as if some guardian spirit approved of her efforts. The cabin's frame was nearly complete now, a skeleton of sturdy logs that would soon be her sanctuary. She'd chosen a simple design, 2 rooms with a stone hearth, a covered porch facing east to catch the morning sun, and windows positioned to provide views of both the forest and the meadow beyond. It would be modest by the standards of her upbringing, but it would be entirely hers. As she positioned another beam, checking it carefully with her father's square, Elira allowed herself to imagine the finished structure. She'd plant a garden in the spring, perhaps keep a few chickens. There were wild berry bushes along the forest edge that could be cultivated, and Henrik had mentioned a stream not far from her property that ran clear and cold year-round. She could build a life here, a real life based on her own choices rather than the ambitions of others. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when she heard the crack of a branch behind her. Elira turned, expecting to see one of the deer that sometimes wandered into the clearing, but found herself face to face with a stranger. He stood at the forest's edge with the stillness of someone accustomed to moving unseen. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by early silver and eyes the color of storm clouds, he had the bearing of a man comfortable with authority. His clothes were well made but practical, leather and wool, suited for travel rather than court display. A sword hung at his side with the casual ease of long familiarity. "I apologize for startling you," he said, his voice carrying a warm timbre that seemed to resonate in the quiet clearing. "I've been watching your progress with great admiration." So he was her mysterious observer. Elira felt her pulse quicken, though whether from alarm or something else entirely, she couldn't say. "You've been watching me." "Not in any way that should concern you," he assured her, taking a careful step closer. "I travel these lands frequently, and I've been impressed by your skill and determination. It's rare to see someone tackle such a project alone, especially," he paused, seeming to weigh his words, "especially a woman." Elira's tone carried just enough edge to let him know she wouldn't tolerate condescension. His smile was genuine, transforming his stern features. "Especially someone building with such clear intention and care." Most people rush their construction, eager to have shelter quickly. You're taking time to do it properly. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. My father taught me that anything worth building is worth building well. A wise man. I'm Ronan, by the way. He inclined his head in a gesture that managed to be respectful without being obsequious. Elira, she studied his face, noting the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners and the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain they'd never met. You said you travel these lands frequently? I have business throughout the borderlands, he replied carefully. Trade routes, territorial disputes, that sort of thing. May I ask what brought you to such a remote location? The question was asked gently, but Elira heard the curiosity beneath it. She'd known this moment would come eventually, when someone would want to know why a woman of obvious breeding had chosen to build a cabin in the wilderness. The truth felt too raw, too personal to share with a stranger, no matter how kind his eyes. I'd needed a change, she said simply. The city didn't suit me. Ronan nodded as if this explanation was perfectly reasonable. The borderlands have a way of calling to those who need space to grow. Your cabin will be beautiful when it's finished. You think so? I'm certain of it. You have good instincts for proportion and placement. He gestured toward the partially completed structure. The way you've positioned it to catch both morning light and the view of the meadow shows real understanding of how a home should sit. In its landscape, Elira found herself pleased by his assessment. Would you like to see the plans? The offer surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She wasn't in the habit of inviting strange men to examine her work, but something about Ronan felt trustworthy. Perhaps it was the way he denounced himself, rather than continuing to watch from hiding, or the genuine appreciation in his voice when he spoke of her craftsmanship. I would be honored, he said. She led him to the makeshift table where she'd spread her drawings, careful sketches that showed not just the cabin's structure, but the surrounding landscape she hoped to develop. Ronan studied them with the attention of someone who understood building, asking thoughtful questions about her choices and offering suggestions with the casual expertise of experience. You've planned for proper drainage, he noted approvingly. Many builders forget that water is a structure's greatest enemy. My father always said to think like the rain, Elira replied. Where does it want to go, and how do you help it get there without washing away your foundation? They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation ranging from construction techniques to the best local sources for various materials. Ronan's knowledge was extensive and practical, and Elira found herself relaxing in his presence. When he finally took his leave, promising to check on her progress during his future travels, she realized she was looking forward to his next visit. It wasn't until evening, as she sat by her small campfire, eating a simple dinner of bread and cheese, that she allowed herself to acknowledge how lonely she'd been. The solitude she treasured was genuine, but human connection was something else entirely, something she hadn't realized she was missing, until a stranger with storm-grey eyes had appeared at the edge of her clearing, to offer both respect and understanding. The royal messenger arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the mist still clung to the valley floor. Elira heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider, a sound that sent ice through her veins, because no one came to her clearing at a gallop unless something was very wrong. She set down her plane and wiped the wood shavings from her hands, watching, as a figure in the king's colors emerged from the forest path. The messenger wore the deep blue and silver that marked him as official court business, his horse lathered from hard riding. Even from a distance, she could see the leather satchel that marked him as carrying sealed correspondence. Her first instinct was to run. The forest was thick enough to lose a mounted man, and she knew the deer paths better than any stranger would. But running would only delay the inevitable. And besides, she'd come too far to let fear drive her decisions now. The messenger reined in his mount at the edge of her clearing, his eyes taking in the half-built cabin with obvious surprise. He was young, perhaps 20, with the soft look of someone who'd never spent much time beyond palace walls. Lady Elira of House Thornfield? His voice cracked slightly on her title. Just Elira, she corrected, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. What brings a royal messenger to the borderlands? He dismounted with the awkward care of someone unused to hard riding, then approached with a sealed letter held formally before him. The wax bore the royal seal, not just any court correspondence, but something from the throne itself. By order of His Majesty King Aldrich, you are summoned to return immediately to the capital to fulfill your obligations to the crown and realm. The words had the rehearsed quality of something memorized, but they hit Elira like physical blows. Nonetheless, she accepted the letter with hands that trembled only slightly, breaking the seal with her father's knife. The parchment was heavy, expensive, the kind reserved for proclamations that brooked no argument. As she read, her throat grew tight with a familiar mixture of rage and despair. The political situation had changed. The northern kingdoms were mobilizing, threatening the trade routes that formed the backbone of the realm's prosperity. New alliances were needed, and Elira's bloodline made her a valuable bargaining chip in negotiations with the Eastern Lords. Her previous engagement had been dissolved, but a new arrangement had been made. This time with Lord Commander Aldwin of the Eastern March, a man whose military reputation was matched only by his cruelty to those who crossed him. There must be some mistake, she said, though she knew there wasn't. I've renounced my claim to House Thornfield's holdings. I have no value in these negotiations. The messenger shifted uncomfortably. My lady, the king's advisors have determined that your bloodline carries weight, regardless of your personal renunciations. Lord Commander Aldwin has specifically requested the match, and His Majesty has agreed. The wedding is to take place within the fortnight. 2 weeks. They were giving her 2 weeks to abandon everything she'd built and submit to another arranged marriage, this time to a man whose reputation for violence was known even in the borderlands. Elira felt the familiar cage closing around her, but this time she was stronger than she'd been before. The months of hard work and independence had forged something unbreakable in her spirit. And if I refuse? The messenger's discomfort deepened. My lady, I'm instructed to inform you that refusal would be considered treason against the crown. The penalty for treason is— I know what the penalty is. Elira's voice was steady now, cold with resolution. When am I expected to return? I am to escort you back immediately. You have until tomorrow morning to gather your belongings. After the messenger departed to make camp in the village, Elira sat alone in her clearing as afternoon shadows lengthened. Around her, the letter lay crumpled at her feet, a piece of expensive parchment that represented the destruction of everything she'd fought to build. She picked up her plane and tried to return to work, but her hands shook too badly to manage. The delicate task of smoothing the cabin's doorframe. She was contemplating burning the letter when Ronan emerged from the forest. Trouble? He asked quietly, his eyes taking in her distress with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to reading situations. The worst kind, she admitted. Royal summons. They want me to return to court for another arranged marriage. Something flickered across Ronan's features, an emotion too quick for her to identify. And you don't wish to go. I'd rather die. The words came out with such vehemence that they surprised even her. I came here to build a life of my own choosing. I won't go back to being a game piece in someone else's political strategy. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, studying the letter she'd dropped. Lord Commander Aldwin, he read. That's a dangerous match to refuse. You know him. By reputation. He's effective in battle but harsh in victory. Not a man who tolerates defiance from anyone, especially wives. Ronan's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. What will you do? I don't know. The admission felt like failure. I could run, but they'd find me eventually. I could fight, but what chance does one woman have against the crown's authority? She gestured helplessly at her half-built cabin. I was so close to having something real, Perhaps you don't have to choose between submission and flight." Elira looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Ronan seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "The borderlands have their own laws, their own protections. Not everything that happens here falls under the direct authority of the capital." "I don't understand." "There are older claims than royal decree, older loyalties than political convenience. If you truly wish to remain here, to finish what you've started, there might be ways to ensure your protection." The careful way he spoke made Elira study his face more closely. There was something he wasn't telling her, some knowledge or authority he wasn't revealing. "Who are you, really?" "Someone who believes in the right of people to choose their own destiny," he said simply. "Someone who has the means to help you fight for yours. If you're willing to trust me, why would you help me? You hardly know me." Ronan's smile was sad and warm at the same time. "Perhaps because I understand what it means to be trapped by others' expectations. Perhaps because I've watched you build something beautiful here, and I believe it deserves to be completed." Elira felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of hope she hadn't dared acknowledge. What would this protection involve? Time, first of all. The legal complexities of challenging a royal summons will take weeks to resolve. During that time, you could continue working on your cabin, living your life as you choose. And then we see what kind of foundation we've built together. The phrasing was odd, but the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Elira realized she was standing at another crossroads, perhaps the most important one of her life. She could submit to the summons and lose everything she'd fought for, or she could trust this mysterious man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was making. "What do you need me to do?" "Meet me here tomorrow at dawn, before the messenger expects to depart." And Elira, his storm-grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever happens in the coming days, remember that you chose this. No one can take that away from you." After he disappeared back into the forest, Elira stood alone in her clearing as night settled around her. The royal letter lay forgotten on the ground, already collecting dew. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't predict. But for the first time since the messenger's arrival, she felt something other than despair. She had an ally now, someone willing to stand between her and the forces that would drag her back to a life of gilded captivity. She didn't know who Ronan really was or what power he possessed, but she believed in the steady strength she'd seen in his eyes. As she banked her fire and prepared for what might be her last night of solitude, Elira made a silent promise to the half-built cabin that stood sentinel in the darkness. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would fight for the life she was building here, one log at a time. Dawn came with a mist that seemed to muffle sound itself. Elira woke before the sun crested the ridge, her body tense with anticipation and dread. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through possibilities and fears until exhaustion finally claimed her near midnight. Now, in the grey pre-dawn light, she felt both determined and terrified. She dressed carefully in her work clothes, practical wool and leather that had become like armor against her old life. Her father's tools were secured in their roll, ready to be hidden if necessary. Whatever Ronan's plan involved, she wouldn't abandon the implements that connected her to honest work and family memory. The messenger's camp lay quiet in the village, smoke from his banked fire visible through the trees. He would expect her to emerge from the forest path within the hour, ready to surrender her freedom for the sake of political necessity. Instead, she waited in her clearing as shadows slowly retreated, and the first birds began their morning songs. Ronan appeared as silently as always, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 men accompanied him, hard-faced individuals with the bearing of professional soldiers. They moved through the forest with practiced quiet, their weapons worn with the ease of long familiarity. Elira felt her pulse quicken as they approached, uncertain whether she was being rescued or captured. "Don't be alarmed," Ronan said softly, noting her tension. "These men are here to ensure your protection, not to threaten it." The soldiers took positions around the clearing's perimeter while Ronan approached her directly. In the growing light, she could see details she'd missed before. The quality of his clothing, the unconscious authority in his bearing, the way the other men deferred to him without question. This was no simple traveler or merchant, whatever he'd led her to believe. "Who are you?" she asked again, more urgently this time. "Someone who has the power to keep you safe," he replied, not quite answering her question. "The royal messenger will find your clearing empty this morning. We've prepared a place where you can wait while legal challenges are mounted against the marriage decree." "What kind of legal challenges?" "Ancient laws regarding forced marriage, questions about the validity of royal decree in borderland territories, procedural requirements that weren't followed in the betrothal negotiations." Ronan's tone was matter-of-fact, but Elira heard the careful planning behind his words. "It will take time to work through the courts, and during that time you'll be under protection that even the crown must respect." One of the soldiers, a grizzled man with silver threading his beard, approached and spoke quietly to Ronan. The conversation was too low for Elira to hear, but she caught references to horses, safe houses, and travel times. When it ended, Ronan turned back to her with an expression that mixed urgency with reassurance. "We need to leave soon. The messenger will discover your absence within the hour, and there will be search parties by midday." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere. You can continue building your life while others fight the legal battles that will secure your freedom permanently." Elira looked around her clearing, at the half-finished cabin that represented everything she'd hoped to become, at the tools and materials she'd gathered with such care, at the small garden plot she'd planned to cultivate in the spring. The thought of leaving it all felt like another kind of death. "What about my cabin?" "It will be here when you return," Ronan promised. "And when you do return, you'll be free to complete it without fear of royal summons or arranged marriages." "How? Can you guarantee that?" For the first time since she'd known him, Ronan hesitated. She could see him weighing words, choosing carefully what to reveal. "Because I have influence in these matters that goes beyond what you might expect from a simple traveler." The careful phrasing only deepened her suspicions. "Your nobility." "I'm someone who believes in justice and has the means to pursue it," he said diplomatically. "Is that enough for now?" It had to be enough. The alternative was surrendering to the messenger and accepting a marriage that would destroy everything she'd fought to build. Elira gathered her few precious possessions, her father's tools, the drawings for her cabin, a small bag of personal items, and followed Ronan into the forest. They traveled north through paths she'd never seen, deeper into the borderlands than she'd ventured during her months of solitude. The country was wilder here, with ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets and streams that ran crystal clear over moss-covered stones. Ronan's men moved with the efficiency of a well-trained unit, scouting ahead and behind while maintaining a protective formation around their small group. During a brief rest beside a mountain brook, Elira found herself riding beside the silver-bearded soldier. His name was Marcus, a coincidence that made her think of her father, and his manner was respectful but distant. "You serve Lord Ronan?" she asked carefully. Marcus's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I serve someone who commands. My loyalty, yes. He's not really a merchant or trader, is he?" "He's many things to many people," Marcus replied diplomatically. "What matters is that he's someone who keeps his word and protects those under his care." The evasiveness was frustrating, but Elira sensed she wouldn't get clearer answers until Ronan chose to provide them. Instead, she focused on the journey itself, the way the landscape changed as they climbed higher into the mountains, the careful attention to their back trail that suggested pursuit was expected, the subtle signals that passed between the soldiers. As they navigated through increasingly remote terrain, they stopped for a longer rest as the sun reached its zenith, choosing a clearing with good sightlines and multiple escape routes. While the soldiers maintained watch, Ronan approached Elira with food and water. "You're wondering what you've gotten yourself into," he observed. The thought had occurred to me. She accepted the provisions gratefully. "I'm grateful for your help, but I feel like I'm missing crucial information about my own rescue. What would you like to know? For starters, who you really are and why you're willing to risk so much to help a stranger." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his storm-grey eyes focused on the distant peaks. "I'm someone who has spent his life serving others' expectations, just as you have. The difference is that I've had the power to make choices about that service, while you've been denied the same freedom. That's not really an answer. It's the beginning of one." He turned to face her directly. "When we reach safety, when you've had time to rest and consider your situation, I'll tell you everything you want to know. But for now, I ask that you trust me a little longer." The sincerity in his voice was hard to question, even as frustration gnawed at her. "Do I have a choice? You always have a choice. If you want to turn back, if you want to face the messenger and accept the marriage to Lord Commander Aldwyn, I'll escort you back to your clearing myself." The offer was genuine, which somehow made it easier to refuse. "No, I've come this far. I'll see where this path leads." "Good." Ronan's smile transformed his stern features. "Because I believe you're going to like the destination." As they resumed their journey into the mountains, Elira tried to quiet the questions that multiplied with each mile. Whatever Ronan's true identity, whatever power he wielded in the shadows of the borderlands, he represented her best hope for the freedom she'd fought so hard to claim. For now, that would have to be enough. The safe house proved to be a mountain lodge built into a natural stone formation, so well camouflaged that Elira didn't see it until they were almost at the door. It was clearly an old structure, with the kind of solid construction that spoke of decades of careful maintenance. Windows were positioned to provide commanding views of the valleys below, while remaining invisible from most angles of approach. Inside, the lodge was comfortable but clearly functional, a place designed for people who needed to disappear for extended periods. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, heavy wooden furniture that looked like it had been built to last generations, and shelves lined with books on subjects ranging from law to military history. It felt like a scholar's retreat crossed with a fortress. "This is yours for as long as you need it," Ronan said, setting down her small pack. "There's food, firewood, and complete privacy. My men will maintain a perimeter, but they won't intrude unless you're in danger." Elira walked to one of the windows, looking out at the forested valley spread below. From this height, she could see for miles. Any approaching threat would be visible long before it became dangerous. "How many people know about this place?" "Very few, and all of them can be trusted with your life." She turned from the window to study his face in the lamplight. The careful authority she'd noticed before was more pronounced here, as if being in this place allowed him to drop some of his disguises. "It's time you told me who you really are." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared into the unlit fireplace. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held secrets. "My name is Ronan Aldrich. I am the king of this realm." The words hit Elira like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling as pieces of a puzzle suddenly rearranged themselves into a picture she should have seen earlier. The unconscious authority, the way his men deferred to him, the resources he could command. It all made terrible sense now. "You're the king," she repeated numbly. "The one who issued the marriage decree." "Yes. The one who ordered me to marry Lord Commander Aldwyn. That decree was issued by my council in my name, but not by my direct order," Ronan said carefully. "The distinction matters, though I understand why it might not feel significant to you right now." Elira's shock was rapidly transforming into anger. "You've been watching me for months. You knew who I was from the beginning." "I did. And you let me believe." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. You let me think you were some traveling merchant who might help me hide from royal authority, when you are the royal authority. Yes. His simple acknowledgement of the deception only fueled her rage. Why? Was this some kind of game? Some royal entertainment to pass the time? No. The word came out sharper than he'd intended. Ronan took a breath, visibly controlling himself. It began as curiosity, I'll admit. Reports reached me of a noble lady who'd fled an arranged marriage to build a cabin in the borderlands. It was so unusual that I wanted to see for myself. And then I watched you work. I saw your determination, your skill, the way you'd found peace in honest labor and solitude. I saw someone building exactly the life she wanted. One careful choice at a time. His voice softened. It was beautiful, Elira. The kind of pure purpose I'd forgotten was possible. The sincerity in his tone didn't soften her anger. So you decided to play some romantic fantasy, the mysterious stranger who befriends the exile. I decided to get to know the woman who could walk away from privilege and power to swing an axe. At dawn, Ronan met her eyes steadily. And the more I knew you, the more I understood that forcing you into another arranged marriage would be a crime against everything that makes you who you are. Pretty words from the man who has the power to stop it with a simple royal decree. It's not that simple. Ronan's expression tightened. The political situation is complex. The northern kingdoms are mobilizing. Trade routes are threatened. And the eastern lords are demanding concessions for their military support. My council views your marriage to Aldwyn as crucial to maintaining the alliance that keeps the realm stable. And what do you view it as? As the destruction of something precious for the sake of political expedience? Elira stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd admired her craftsmanship with the king who commanded armies and issued marriage decrees. If you believe that, then why don't you simply rescind the order? Because a king's word, once given publicly, cannot be easily withdrawn without serious consequences. If I appear weak or indecisive, if the eastern lords lose faith in our alliance, the entire realm could fall to northern aggression within months. So you brought me here to hide while you figure out how to preserve both your political arrangements. And your conscience? The accusation stung. She could see it in his eyes. I brought you here to keep you safe, while I find a way to honor both my duty to the realm and my conviction that you deserve the freedom to choose your own life. And if those two things prove incompatible, Ronan was quiet for a long moment, then I'll have to decide which duty matters more. The one I owe to my crown, or the one I owe to my conscience. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Elira could see the genuine conflict in his face, the weight of responsibility that seemed to age him before her eyes. Despite her anger at his deception, she found herself believing that his concern for her welfare was real. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked quietly. "My freedom, my choices. Why should a king care about one woman's happiness?" "Because I've spent my entire life watching people be sacrificed for political necessity," Ronan said. "Because I've seen too many marriages arranged for strategic advantage and too many lives diminished for the sake of royal convenience. And because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Because watching you build your cabin, seeing the peace you'd found in choosing your own path, made me realize how empty my own life has become. I've been king for 15 years, and I can't remember the last time I made a choice based purely on what I believed was right, rather than what was politically necessary. The raw honesty in his voice caught Elira off guard. She could see the loneliness beneath his royal authority, the isolation that came from bearing responsibility for an entire realm while having no one to share the burden with. "That doesn't excuse the deception," she said, though her anger was beginning to cool. "No, it doesn't. I should have told you who I was from the beginning. I should have been honest about the complexity of your situation and the limitations of what I could offer." Ronan moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I was selfish. For a few hours each week, I could be just a man who admired a woman's skill and determination. I could forget about crowns and councils and the weight of decisions that affect thousands of lives. And now you know the truth. And you have to decide whether you can trust a king who's been lying to you, even if his reasons were more about self-preservation than malice. Elira walked to the fireplace, running her fingers along the rough stone mantel as she processed everything she'd learned. The man she'd begun to care for was also the source of her greatest fear, the royal authority that could destroy her freedom. With a word, yet he was also offering to risk his own position to protect that freedom, which suggested a complexity she hadn't expected from the distant figure she'd always imagined the king to be. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you rest while I return to court and begin the delicate work of untangling the political mess my council has created. I'll need to find alternative ways to secure the Eastern Alliance, legal grounds to challenge the marriage decree, or," he paused, or I'll need to decide how much I'm willing to sacrifice for the principle that people should be free to choose their own destiny." The weight in his voice told her he was contemplating options that went far beyond simple political maneuvering. "You'd risk your throne for this." "I'd risk my throne for you," he said simply. The admission hung between them like a confession of something far deeper than political sympathy. Elira felt her heart racing as she realized that the connection she'd felt during their conversations in the clearing had been real for both of them. Complicated now by the revelation of his identity, but no less genuine for the deception that had surrounded it. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course. I'll return to court tomorrow and begin working on solutions. Marcus will remain here with his men to ensure your safety." Ronan moved toward the door, then paused. "Elira, yes? Whatever else you believe about me, believe this. I will not allow you to be forced into a marriage you don't want. That's a promise from Ronan the man, not a decree from the king." After he left, Elira stood alone in the mountain lodge as evening shadows crept across the valley below. Everything had changed in the space of a single conversation, yet somehow the fundamental truth remained the same. She was fighting for the right to choose her own life, and she now had an ally whose power was matched by the complexity of the risks he was willing to take on her behalf. The discarded engagement ring that had started her journey felt like a lifetime ago. Now she faced a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the stability of an entire kingdom. The woman who had fled an arranged marriage was about to discover that her personal rebellion had become entangled with forces much larger than her own desire for freedom. 3 days passed in the mountain lodge like a suspended breath. Elira found herself caught between relief at her temporary safety and anxiety about the political machinations unfolding in her absence. Marcus and his men maintained their vigilant watch, but they were respectful of her need for solitude as she wrestled with the implications of Ronan's revelation. On the 4th morning, Marcus approached her with news that sent ice through her veins. "Royal search parties have been spotted in the lower valleys," he reported, his weathered face grim. "Lord Commander Aldwyn himself is leading one of the groups. They're moving systematically, checking every settlement and homestead." Elira felt her stomach drop. "How close are they?" "Still several miles away, but they're moving with purpose. Someone has given them information about the general area where you might be hiding." The implication was clear. Their sanctuary was no longer secure. "What do?" "We move deeper into the mountains. There's another safe house 2 days hard travel from here, in territory that even royal authority can't easily reach." Marcus studied her face carefully. "But I need to warn you, the journey will be difficult, and the destination is more isolated than this place." Elira thought of her half-built cabin, abandoned now for over a week. Each day she spent running from royal authority was another day. Her dreams remained unfinished, another step away from the life she'd been trying to build. "Is there any word from the king?" He sent a coded message yesterday. The political situation at court is complicated. Lord Commander Aldwin has convinced the Council that your disappearance represents a deliberate insult to the Eastern Alliance. He's demanding immediate action to secure your return. And the King's response, Marcus's expression was carefully neutral. His Majesty is exploring all available options while maintaining the delicate balance required to preserve the realm's stability. The diplomatic language couldn't hide the reality. Ronan was fighting a losing battle against political forces stronger than his personal convictions. Elira felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders, the crushing awareness that her individual desires were once again being sacrificed for larger concerns. How long before we need to leave? Within the hour, the search parties are moving faster than we anticipated. As Elira gathered her few belongings, she noticed Marcus preparing supplies for an extended journey. The sight of traveling packs and military provisions drove home the reality of her situation. She was no longer a woman who'd chosen to build a cabin in the borderlands. She was a fugitive, running from the very authority that should have protected her right to choose her own destiny. The second safe house lay hidden in a valley so remote that even Marcus's men seemed uncertain of the path. They traveled through terrain that grew increasingly wild and treacherous, following game trails and ancient paths that wound between peaks shrouded in permanent mist. The air grew thinner as they climbed, and Elira found herself struggling to match the pace that came naturally to the hardened soldiers. During a rest stop beside a mountain stream, one of the younger guards approached Marcus with obvious concern. Smoke. Signals from the southern peaks, he reported quietly. Could be search parties coordinating their movements. Marcus studied the distant ridges with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading the landscape for threats. They're closing the net systematically. Professional work. Lord Commander Aldwin's reputation isn't built on empty boasts, another guard observed grimly. He's never failed to complete a mission once he's committed to it. The casual mention of her intended bridegroom's military prowess made Elira's skin crawl. She'd heard stories about Aldwin's campaigns, victories achieved through ruthless efficiency and a willingness to employ whatever brutality the situation required. The thought of being bound to such a man for the sake of political alliance made her stomach turn. What kind of man is he? She asked Marcus during the next stage of their journey. The older soldier was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. Lord Commander Aldwin is effective in his role. His military achievements have secured significant advantages for the realm. That's not what I asked. Marcus met her eyes with the directness of a man who decided honesty was kinder than diplomacy. He's the kind of man who views people as resources to be deployed for strategic advantage. Marriage to him would be another form of military alliance, useful for achieving objectives, but not something that requires consideration for the other party's feelings or desires. The assessment was delivered without emotion, but its implications were chilling. Elira had escaped one arranged marriage to a man who saw her as a useful acquisition, only to be pursued for another that would be even worse. The injustice of it burned in her chest like physical pain. They reached the second safe house as evening shadows were lengthening across the mountain valley. This refuge was smaller than the lodge, more of a hunting cabin than a residence. But it was even better concealed. Built into the side of a cliff face, it was invisible from below and accessible only by a narrow path that could be easily defended. Inside, the accommodations were Spartan but adequate. A single room with a stone fireplace, supplies for extended hiding, and windows that provided commanding views of the approaches without exposing the inhabitants to observation. It felt more like a military outpost than a place of sanctuary. As Marcus posted guards and secured the perimeter, Elira stood at the single window, looking out at the wilderness that had become her world. Somewhere far below, in valleys she could no longer see, lay the clearing where her cabin waited unfinished. The distance between her current refuge and her abandoned dreams felt measured in more than miles. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Marcus entered carrying a leather satchel that bore the royal seal. "Another message from the king," he said, offering her the packet. Elira broke the seal with trembling fingers, hoping for news that might change her desperate situation. The letter was written in Ronan's own hand, his script careful and controlled, despite what must have been significant stress. The political situation had deteriorated further. Lord Commander Aldwin had convinced the council that her continued absence was a deliberate slight against the Eastern Alliance that required immediate correction. Worse, intelligence reports suggested that the northern kingdoms were interpreting the domestic instability as weakness, accelerating their own military preparations. Ronan was running out of time and options. The legal challenges to the marriage decree were proceeding slowly through courts that seemed reluctant to challenge royal council decisions. Alternative alliance arrangements with the Eastern Lords were being rejected because Aldwin specifically wanted the marriage connection to House Thornfield's bloodline. The letter's final paragraph made Elira's heart race. "I may soon be forced to choose between preserving the stability of the realm and honoring my promise to protect your freedom. If that moment comes, I want you to know that I will choose based on what I believe you would want me to do, not what political expedience demands. Your courage in choosing your own path has taught me what it means to make decisions based on principle rather than convenience. Whatever the cost, I will not allow you to be sacrificed for the sake of others' ambitions." As night settled over the mountain refuge, Elira realized that her personal rebellion had become something much larger and more dangerous than she'd ever intended. A king was risking his throne for her freedom, a military commander was mobilizing resources to force her compliance, and the stability of an entire realm hung in the balance of her individual choice to build a cabin in the borderlands. The half-built walls that represented her dreams of independence had become the foundation for a conflict that could reshape the political landscape of the kingdom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had to face the terrifying reality that her desire for personal freedom had become entangled with forces that could determine the fate of thousands. The map fragment changed everything. Elira discovered it tucked between the pages of her father's journal, a piece of parchment so old and carefully preserved that she almost missed it during her restless examination of her few personal belongings. The afternoon light streaming through the cabin's single window revealed faded ink lines that traced the borderlands with meticulous detail. But these weren't ordinary geographical markings. Symbols were scattered across the map's surface, intricate designs that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond her understanding. At certain intersections of land features, the symbols grew more complex, incorporating elements that looked almost magical in their complexity. Her clearing, the place where she'd chosen to build her cabin, was marked with the most elaborate symbol of all. "Marcus," she called, her voice tight with discovery. "I need you to see this." The grizzled soldier examined the map fragment with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading intelligence documents. His expression grew increasingly grave as he studied the symbols and their placement. "Where did you find this?" "In my father's belongings. I thought it was just his." "Record of land surveys in the borderlands." Elira pointed to the symbol marking her clearing, but this suggests something else entirely. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his weathered fingers tracing the ancient markings. "These symbols match descriptions I've seen in military archives. References to the old protections that were established when the kingdom was founded." "What kind of protections?" "Magical barriers designed to prevent invasion from the wild lands beyond the borders. According to legend, certain bloodlines were bound to maintain these protections through ritual and residence in specific locations." He met her eyes with a look that mixed understanding with concern. "Your father wasn't just a lord with lands in the borderlands. He was a guardian of one of the primary anchor points. The implications hit Elira like a physical blow. That's why they want me to marry Aldwin. Not just for political alliance, but because my bloodline is connected to the kingdom's magical defenses. It would explain the urgency, the specific insistence on your marriage rather than accepting alternative arrangements. Marcus folded the map carefully. And it means your situation is more dangerous than any of us realized. Before Elira could respond, a sharp whistle from the perimeter guards cut through the afternoon air. Marcus was instantly alert, moving to the window with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to sudden threats. Riders, approaching from the south, he reported grimly, moving fast and in formation. Through the narrow window, Elira could see dust clouds rising from the valley floor. Far below, even at this distance, the organized movement of the approaching force was unmistakable. This wasn't a random patrol, but a targeted search operation. How many? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. At least 20, possibly more behind. The advance group. Marcus was already moving toward the door. We need to prepare for siege or evacuation. Siege. They've found us. Lord Commander Aldwin doesn't send 20 men on speculation. Someone has provided him with specific intelligence about our location. The betrayal stung, even though Elira couldn't identify its source. Someone with knowledge of the safe houses and their protocols had sold that information to her pursuers. The network of protection Ronan had established was compromised, which meant nowhere in the borderlands would be truly safe. As Marcus's men took defensive positions around the cliffside cabin, Elira found herself thinking about the half-built walls of her own cabin. The symbol on her father's map suggested that her choice of location hadn't been as random as she'd believed. Some deep instinct had drawn her to a place of power and responsibility that she'd never understood. "There's something else," she said, calling Marcus back before he could join his men. "If my bloodline is connected to the kingdom's magical protections, what happens if I'm forced into marriage with Aldwin?" Marcus's expression was grim. "That would depend on the specific nature of the binding rituals. Some magical protections transfer to the husband upon marriage, others remain with the bloodline regardless of martial status. And if they transfer, then Lord Commander Aldwin would control not just his military forces and Eastern Alliance, but also the magical barriers that protect the entire kingdom from external threats." The political ramifications were staggering. Aldwin wouldn't just be gaining a wife and a strategic alliance. He'd be positioning himself to control the kingdom's primary magical defenses. No wonder he'd been so insistent on this specific marriage, and no wonder Ronan's council viewed it as politically essential. "That's not marriage," Elira said quietly. "That's conquest by legal ceremony, which is why his pursuit has been so relentless," Marcus agreed, "and why your escape represents more than personal rebellion. It's a threat to his larger ambitions." The sound of hoofbeats was growing closer, echoing off the valley walls as the approaching riders navigated the treacherous mountain paths. Marcus's men had taken positions that would allow them to defend the cabin's narrow approach, but Elira could see the tension in their movements. They were outnumbered and trapped in a position that offered protection, but no escape route. "How long can we hold them off?" she asked. "Depends on their determination and resources. If they're willing to sustain casualties and have adequate supplies, they can simply wait us out." Marcus checked his weapons with the automatic movements of long practice. "Our advantage is defensive position and knowledge of the terrain. Their advantage is numbers and the fact that they don't need to take prisoners. Lord Commander Aldwin wants you alive, but he doesn't necessarily want you unharmed." The casual mention of potential violence made Elira's stomach turn, but it also crystallized her resolve. She'd spent too many months building her independence to surrender it now, regardless of the magical significance that others wanted to assign to her bloodline. "Is there any way to get word to the king, not without compromising our position?" Further, and based on his last message, he may be facing his own political crisis by now. Elira moved to the window, studying the approaching dust clouds with growing determination. Somewhere in that force was Lord Commander Aldwin himself, the man who wanted to claim not just her hand, but her heritage for his own ambitions. The thought of surrendering to such calculated manipulation filled her with a cold rage that surprised her with its intensity. "Marcus," she said quietly, "if the magical protections are connected to my bloodline and my presence in specific locations, what would happen if I were to die rather than submit to forced marriage?" The older soldier's face went pale. "My lady, such thoughts. Answer the question. What would happen to the kingdom's defenses?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of her inquiry. The protections would likely fail gradually, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to invasion from the wild lands. It would be a catastrophe that could take generations to rebuild. And if I marry Aldwin, the protections might transfer to his control, giving him power that could rival or exceed the king's authority. Elira nodded slowly, understanding finally crystallizing in her mind. Her personal choices had become entangled with the fate of an entire kingdom, but that didn't mean she was powerless. If anything, it meant her decisions carried weight that could reshape the political landscape entirely. "Then we need to find a third option," she said firmly, "one that preserves both the kingdom's safety and my right to choose my own destiny." The approaching hoofbeats were close enough now to distinguish individual horses. Soon, the confrontation that had been building since the royal messenger's arrival at her clearing would finally come to its inevitable head. But Elira was no longer the frightened woman who'd considered burning a royal summons. She was someone who understood the true stakes of her situation, and she was prepared to fight for a solution that would preserve both personal freedom and the larger good that depended on her choices. The riders who emerged from the mountain weren't Lord Commander Aldwin's forces at all. Ronan appeared at the head of a column of his personal guard, his face grim with urgency and something that looked like barely controlled desperation. Behind him rode men Elira recognized from their journey to the mountain lodge, but their formation and pace spoke of crisis rather than routine escort duty. Marcus lowered his weapons with obvious relief, but his expression remained wary. Kings didn't personally ride into remote mountain refuges unless circumstances had become dire beyond normal political maneuvering. "Your Majesty," Marcus said as Ronan dismounted, "we weren't expecting—" "The situation has changed dramatically," Ronan interrupted, his storm-grey eyes finding Elira immediately. "Lord Commander Aldwin has forced the Council's hand. We have perhaps hours before events spiral beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution." Elira stepped forward, her heart racing at the intensity of his expression. "What's happened?" "Aldwin has presented the Council with evidence that your bloodline isn't just connected to the kingdom's magical protections. You're the primary anchor for the entire defensive network." Ronan pulled a leather satchel from his saddlebags, removing a document that looked ancient enough to crumble at his touch. "This is the original Kingdom Charter, signed by my ancestor and your family's patriarch when the realm was founded. It details the magical compact that has protected our borders for 3 centuries. The parchment was covered in symbols that matched those on her father's map fragment, but these were arranged in formal patterns that suggested legal binding rather than geographical reference. As Elira examined the document, she could feel something responding to her touch, a warmth that seemed to flow from the ancient ink into her skin. "According to this charter," Ronan continued, "the magical protections binding the kingdom against invasion from the wild lands are anchored by bloodline inheritance and maintained through residence at specific locations. Your father was the last direct male heir of the founding family. Upon his death, the responsibility passed to you. That's why they insisted on my presence at specific court ceremonies," Elira realized, remembering formal events she'd thought were simple social obligations. I wasn't just attending as nobility, I was fulfilling magical requirements. Exactly. And when you fled to the borderlands and began building your cabin in the old Thornfield clearing, you unknowingly strengthened the protections beyond their normal levels. Your presence there, combined with your active intention to build and remain, created a magical resonance that reinforced the entire defensive network. Marcus studied the charter with growing understanding, which explains why the wildlands have been unusually quiet these past months. The magical barriers have been stronger than they've been in decades. But it also means that your marriage to Lord Commander Aldwin would transfer control of those protections to him directly, Ronan said, his voice tight with concern. The charter specifies that magical authority passes to the husband upon marriage, giving him power that would effectively supersede royal authority in matters of border defense and territorial control. The political implications were staggering. Aldwin wouldn't just be gaining strategic alliance through marriage. He'd be positioning himself to control the kingdom's primary magical defenses while commanding the largest military force in the Eastern Territories. The combination would make him the most powerful individual in the realm, potentially more powerful than the king himself. He's been planning this for years, Elira said, understanding finally clicking into place. The insistence on marriage. To someone from my specific bloodline, the timing of the proposal when political pressure was greatest, the refusal to consider alternative alliance arrangements. It was never about securing cooperation, it was about acquiring magical authority. And the council sees his marriage to you as the simplest solution to multiple problems, Ronan confirmed grimly. It secures the Eastern Alliance, reinforces the magical protections, and removes a source of political embarrassment. Your public refusal to accept arranged marriage, all in a single ceremony. What about your authority as king? Elira asked. Can't you simply refuse to allow the marriage? Ronan's expression was pained. I tried. Aldwin presented his case to the full council this morning, supported by legal scholars who argued that royal authority cannot supersede ancient magical compacts without risking the kingdom's fundamental security. They've given me until sunset to produce you for immediate marriage ceremony, or they'll consider my refusal an abdication of royal responsibility. The ultimatum hung between them like a blade. Elira could see the conflict tearing at Ronan. His duty as king demanded he preserve the kingdom's stability, but his personal convictions recoiled from sacrificing her freedom for political expedience. And if you refuse, then the council will declare my fitness for rule compromised by personal attachment, remove me from the throne, and install Aldwin as regent until a suitable heir can be found or elected. Ronan met her eyes with devastating honesty. He wins either way, through marriage to you or through seizing royal authority directly. There has to be another option. I've exhausted every legal avenue. The charter is clear, the magical requirements are inflexible, and the political pressure is overwhelming. Ronan's voice carried the weight of a man who discovered the limits of even royal power. Unless we can find some alternative that satisfies both the magical requirements and the political necessities, I'll have to choose between preserving my throne and honoring my promise to protect your freedom. Elira looked again at the ancient charter, studying the symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond her comprehension. The magical compact that bound her bloodline to the kingdom's protection was older and more complex than she'd understood, but it was also more specific than anyone seemed to have realized. Ronan, she said slowly, a possibility beginning to form in her mind. The charter mentions residence at specific locations as part of maintaining the magical protections. Yes, your family's traditional lands, which include the clearing where you've been building your cabin, but it doesn't specify that residence must be maintained through marriage alliance, does it? Ronan leaned closer, studying the ancient text with renewed attention. It specifies bloodline inheritance and territorial residence, but the marriage provisions seem to be focused on transfer of authority rather than maintenance of the protections themselves. What if the protections don't need to be transferred at all? What if they can be maintained by bloodline residence without involving marriage or political alliance? Marcus had been following the conversation with growing excitement. If the magical requirements can be satisfied without marriage, then the political pressure for the Aldwin alliance loses its foundation. But that would require you to permanently commit to maintaining residence in the borderlands, Ronan pointed out. You'd be bound to the land by magical compact, responsible for preserving protections that affect the entire kingdom. It wouldn't be the simple freedom you originally sought. Elira thought of her half-built cabin waiting in the distant clearing, of the life she'd been trying to build, one log at a time. The choice being offered wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between different forms of responsibility, different ways of serving something larger than herself. Would it be service freely chosen or obligation imposed? That would depend on how you approached it, Ronan said carefully. The magical compact requires residence and intention, but it doesn't dictate the specific form that residence must take. The solution was beginning to crystallize in Elira's mind, a path that could preserve both her personal autonomy and the kingdom's security while thwarting Aldwin's ambitions for magical authority. It wouldn't be the simple independence she'd originally envisioned, but it would be a life chosen rather than imposed, built on her own terms rather than others' political convenience. I need to return to my cabin, she said firmly. If the magical protections are anchored by bloodline residence at the traditional location, then that's where this needs to be resolved. Aldwin's forces are converging on the borderlands, Marcus warned. Returning to your clearing would be walking directly into his trap. Then we'll have to make sure it's our trap instead of his, Elira replied. If I'm going to accept magical responsibility for protecting the kingdom, I'm going to do it on ground I've chosen, in a home I've built with my own hands. Ronan studied her face with an expression that mixed admiration with deep concern. You understand what you're proposing. This isn't just about refusing an arranged marriage anymore. You'd be claiming magical authority that could reshape the political balance of the entire realm. I understand that I'm choosing to serve something larger than myself, but on terms that honor both my own autonomy and the greater good. Elira met his eyes steadily. The question is whether you're willing to support that choice, even if it means confronting Aldwin directly and risking everything you've tried to preserve through political compromise. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across an abyss. Ronan had to choose between the safety of careful diplomacy and the risk of standing behind principles that could cost him his throne. But as Elira watched, she saw the same transformation in his expression that she'd felt in her own heart. The shift from fear to determination, from preservation to purpose. Then we ride for your cabin, he said simply, and we finish what you started building there. The journey back to Elira's clearing felt like riding toward destiny itself. They traveled through the night, following paths that Ronan's men knew by heart, but that seemed transformed by moonlight and urgency into something altogether more mystical. The closer they drew to the borderlands, the more Elira could feel something stirring in her blood, a resonance with the land that she'd never consciously noticed, but that had been growing stronger during her months of building and dwelling. In the ancient territory, Ronan rode beside her, his face set with the grim determination of a man who'd finally chosen principle over political expedience. The unsigned abdication papers, tucked in his saddlebags, represented more than just a political contingency. They were a symbol of his willingness to sacrifice everything for the conviction that some things mattered more than crowns and kingdoms. You understand what we're likely to face, he said during a brief rest beside a mountain stream. "Aldwin won't simply accept defeat, even if we can prove that the magical protections don't require marriage alliance. He's invested too much in this campaign to withdraw gracefully. What do you think he'll do? He'll attempt to claim you by force, argue that magical compact requires male oversight, regardless of the Charter's specific language, or," Ronan paused, his expression darkening, "or he'll try to destroy the protections entirely if he can't control them." The possibility sent ice through Elira's veins. Can the magical barriers be destroyed? The old texts suggest that sufficient disruption of the anchor points could collapse the entire network. It would leave the kingdom vulnerable to invasion from the wild lands, but it would also eliminate the magical authority that he's trying to claim through marriage. He'd risk the kingdom's safety out of spite. He'd risk anything to prevent someone else from wielding power he believes should be his. Ronan's tone carried the weight of long experience with Aldwin's character. The man who would force you into marriage for political gain is capable of much worse when his ambitions are thwarted. As dawn approached, they could see smoke rising from the direction of Elira's clearing. Not the thin wisps of a cookfire, but the thick, dark columns that spoke of structures burning. Ronan spurred his horse forward, his face pale with understanding of what they were likely to find. The scene that greeted them was devastating in its calculated destruction. Elira's cabin, the symbol of everything she'd fought to build, lay in smoldering ruins. The carefully fitted logs she'd shaped and positioned with such care were scattered like broken bones, the stone foundation cracked and displaced. Even her woodworking tools lay twisted and destroyed, as if someone had taken deliberate pleasure in desecrating every symbol of her independence. Lord Commander Aldwin stood amid the wreckage with a contingent of his soldiers, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the destruction with obvious satisfaction. He was a tall man, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his graying beard meticulously groomed and his uniform immaculate despite the campaign conditions. When he saw their approach, his smile was cold enough to freeze blood. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow that managed to convey mockery rather than respect. "Lady Elira, how good of you to join us for this morning's lesson in the consequences of defying legitimate authority." Elira felt rage burning in her chest as she looked at the ruins of her dreams, but she forced herself to remain calm. This destruction was meant to break her spirit, to demonstrate her powerlessness against forces larger than her individual will. She wouldn't give Aldwin the satisfaction of seeing how deeply it wounded her. "An impressive display of military might against an empty building," she said evenly. "I'm sure your men are proud of such a glorious victory." Aldwin's smile widened. "Oh, this isn't the victory, my dear. This is merely clearing the ground for new construction. When we're married, I'll build you a proper residence here, something befitting the wife of the kingdom's most powerful lord." "The lady is under royal protection," Ronan said, his voice carrying the full authority of the crown. "Any attempt to force marriage without consent will be considered an act of treason." "Treason?" Aldwin laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "From the king who's abandoned his responsibilities to chase after a rebellious noble girl? The council has already voted, Your Majesty. Your authority in this matter has been superseded by magical necessity and political reality." "The council exceeds its authority," Ronan replied, but Elira could hear the uncertainty beneath his formal protest. The political ground was shifting under all of them, and traditional lines of power were proving inadequate to address the current crisis. The council acts to preserve the realm when its king proves unfit to do so. Aldwin gestured toward his soldiers, who began forming a loose circle around the ruined clearing. "Lady Elira will accompany me to the capital for immediate marriage ceremony, and the magical protections will be properly secured under male authority as the founders intended." "The founders intended no such thing," Elira said, stepping forward. Despite the obvious threat, the Charter specifies bloodline inheritance and territorial residence, not gender-based authority transfer. Pretty words from someone who spent months playing at independence while the kingdom's security hung in the balance. Aldwin's tone grew harsher. Your childish rebellion ends now, my lady. You'll fulfill your obligations to the realm, willingly or otherwise. The threat was unmistakable. But as Aldwin spoke, Elira became aware of something else, a growing warmth in her hands, a sensation like touching sun-heated stone. The ancient charter in Ronan's saddlebags seemed to be responding to her proximity, to the traditional anchor point, even with her cabin destroyed and the foundation stones scattered. "Ronan," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Aldwin. "The charter, I think I can feel it responding to this place." Understanding flickered across the king's face. Even with the physical structures destroyed, the magic isn't bound to buildings. It's bound to bloodline and intention. Elira took another step forward, and the warmth in her hands intensified. "He can destroy what I've built, but he can't destroy what I am or where I choose to stand." Aldwin's expression shifted from confidence to wariness as he noticed the change in her demeanor. "What are you doing?" "I'm accepting my heritage," Elira replied simply, "and claiming my right to fulfill it on my own terms." The ground beneath her feet began to warm, and she could see similar responses from the scattered foundation stones of her destroyed cabin. Whatever magical energy had been anchored here for centuries was recognizing her presence and responding to her conscious choice to embrace rather than flee from her responsibilities. "Stop this immediately," Aldwin commanded, drawing his sword. "I won't allow you to corrupt the ancient protections with your selfish interpretation of proper authority." "Then stop me," Elira challenged, spreading her arms wide as energy continued to build around her. "But understand that destroying me destroys the protections entirely. Are you willing to leave the kingdom defenseless to satisfy your personal ambitions?" The standoff crystallized around this impossible choice. Aldwin could attempt to claim her by force, but any violence that killed or severely injured her would collapse the magical barriers that protected the entire realm. He could retreat and accept defeat, but that would mean abandoning everything he'd worked toward for years. Or he could try to destroy the magical protections entirely and blame the catastrophe on royal incompetence and her rebellion. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Test me," Elira replied calmly. "But remember that I'm the woman who walked away from privilege and power to build a cabin with her own hands. I'm not afraid of consequences. When I believe I'm fighting for something that matters." Ronan moved to stand beside her, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "The Crown supports Lady Elira's interpretation of the Charter and her right to fulfill her magical obligations without coercion. Any attempt to force compliance will be met with royal resistance." "You'd risk civil war for this?" Aldwin demanded. "I'd risk anything to preserve the principle that power should serve justice rather than personal ambition," Ronan replied steadily. "The question is what you're willing to risk for yours." The magical energy building around Elira had grown strong, enough to be visible now, a soft golden glow that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The scattered stones of her foundation were beginning to resonate in harmony, creating a low humming that spoke of forces far older than any of the political struggles playing out above them. Aldwin's soldiers were growing visibly nervous as they watched the display. These were practical men who'd signed on for political enforcement, not magical confrontation. Several had already taken unconscious steps backward, their hands moving nervously to weapons that would be useless against the forces their commander was attempting to challenge. "You have a choice to make, Lord Commander," Elira said, her voice carrying new authority that seemed to come from the land itself. "You can accept that the magical protections will be maintained by bloodline inheritance and free choice, or you can attempt to destroy them and explain to the kingdom why you left them defenseless against invasion from the wild lands. Or, she continued, the golden glow intensifying around her, you can try to take me by force and discover whether someone who spent months building her own sanctuary might have learned a few things about defending it. The threat wasn't empty. Elira could feel power flowing through her connection to the ancient anchor point. Not just the passive energy of magical protection, but something more active and defensive. Her months of living and working on this land had created a bond deeper than simple residence. She belonged here now, and the magic that protected the kingdom recognized that belonging. Aldwin raised his sword, his face twisted with rage and frustration. If I can't have the protections, then no one will. Better a kingdom defended by steel than one held hostage by an ungrateful woman's whims. Aldwin, don't be a fool, Ronan warned, but the Lord Commander was beyond listening to reason. Years of careful planning and political maneuvering had been reduced to this moment of choice, and he was choosing destruction over defeat. As he stepped forward with obvious violent intent, Elira felt the magical energy around her shift from defensive to actively protective. The scattered stones of her foundation began to glow with the same golden light that surrounded her, and the very air seemed to thicken with potential. Last chance, she said quietly. Choose wisdom over pride. But Aldwin was already moving, his sword raised to strike down the woman who dared to thwart his ambitions. The confrontation that had been building since the royal messenger's arrival at her clearing was finally about to reach its inevitable conclusion. Not in the political chambers where such disputes were usually settled, but on the ancient ground where magic and will would determine the fate of an entire kingdom. The golden light around Elira flared brighter as power older than the realm itself prepared to defend its chosen guardian against those who would claim her heritage through force and fear. Aldwin's sword never reached its target. The moment his blade began its descent toward Elira, the golden energy surrounding her exploded outward in a wave of protective force that sent the Lord Commander stumbling backward. The scattered stones of her destroyed foundation rose from the ground, positioning themselves with deliberate precision, as if guided by invisible hands. Within moments, the basic framework of her cabin's walls had reassembled itself, glowing with the same warm light that emanated from Elira herself. Impossible, Aldwin gasped, staring at the supernatural display with a mixture of rage and fear. The magic doesn't work that way. It requires proper ritual, male oversight. It requires authentic connection, Elira corrected, her voice carrying new strength and authority. Something you've never understood about power or protection. Around them, Aldwin's soldiers were backing away from the magical reconstruction with obvious terror. These were men trained for conventional warfare, not mystical confrontations that defied everything they understood about the natural world. Several had already dropped their weapons, unwilling to raise arms against forces so clearly beyond mortal combat. Ronan watched the unfolding display with wonder and growing understanding. The magic recognizes your intention to build and protect rather than claim and control. It recognizes home, Elira replied simply, extending her hands toward the reconstructing walls. This isn't about wielding power, it's about belonging to something larger than myself and allowing that connection to flow both ways. The cabin's framework was solidifying now, logs fitting together with precision that surpassed even her careful craftsmanship. But this wasn't just magical reconstruction, it was transformation. The structure taking shape was still recognizably her design, but enhanced and strengthened by forces that understood both her vision and the deeper purpose it served. Aldwin rallied his remaining courage, raising his sword again despite the obvious futility of the gesture. I won't allow you to corrupt the ancient protections with your feminine interpretation of proper authority. The founders established male guardianship for good reason. The founders established bloodline inheritance and territorial connection. Elira countered, stepping closer to the reforming cabin walls. Gender was never the determining factor. Dedication was. As she spoke, she could feel her father's woodworking tools responding to the magical energy, rising from where they'd been scattered and destroyed to hover in the air around her. The metal gleamed as if newly forged, the wooden handles warm, with life and purpose. Without conscious thought, she reached for her father's plane, and it settled into her palm with the familiar weight of inherited skill and love. "This is what the magic recognizes," she said, running the plane along one of the reconstructed logs with smooth, practiced motion. Honest work, genuine care, the intention to build something that will last. A perfect curl of wood shavings fell away, glowing briefly before settling to the ground. You wanted to own the protections, to add them to your collection of conquered territories, but they can't be owned, only served. The cabin walls were complete now, rising around her like a sanctuary that bridged the physical and mystical worlds. Windows appeared in their proper positions, and she could see the interior taking shape, simple, functional, beautiful in its honest purpose. This was her vision made manifest, but enhanced by magical forces that understood the deeper significance of what she'd been trying to create. "The ancient compact isn't about marriage or political alliance," she continued, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized. "It's about choosing to serve something larger than personal ambition, to build rather than conquer, to protect rather than control." Aldwin's face was twisted with frustrated rage as he watched his carefully laid plans crumble around him. "You think pretty words and magical displays change the political reality? The Council will never accept female authority over the protections. The Eastern Lords will withdraw their support rather than acknowledge a woman's right to refuse marriage. Alliance, then they'll learn to adapt," Ronan said firmly, stepping closer to the reconstructed cabin. "Because this is what genuine magical authority looks like, and anyone who opposes it is opposing the safety of the entire realm." The king's support gave Elira strength to take the final step of her transformation. Placing both hands on the cabin's walls, she felt the magical energy flow through her into the structure itself. The building settled with a sound like a contented sigh, its foundation stones sinking deep into the earth as roots of light spread outward through the soil. She could feel the connection expanding beyond her clearing, touching the network of anchor points that protected the kingdom's borders. Each location pulsed with renewed strength as her conscious acceptance of guardianship reinforced the ancient compact. The wild lands beyond the borders stirred uneasily as barriers they'd tested for centuries suddenly blazed with power they hadn't felt in generations. "The protections are secure," she announced, turning to face Aldwin with quiet confidence. "Maintained by free choice and authentic connection rather than forced marriage and political convenience. Your services are no longer required, Lord Commander." But Aldwin wasn't finished fighting. If he couldn't control the magical protections, he could still attempt to destroy them, and her along with them. Drawing a second blade from his belt, he signaled to his remaining soldiers to surround the cabin, despite their obvious reluctance. "If I can't have what's rightfully mine," he snarled, "then I'll make sure no one else can either." The final confrontation was about to begin. But now, Elira stood protected by forces that recognized her right to be exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The attack came from three directions at once. Aldwin had finally convinced his remaining soldiers to advance, despite their fear, promising them land and gold if they could capture Elira alive and destroy the magical cabin that had become the symbol of her defiance. They moved with the coordination of professional warriors, but they were fighting forces they didn't understand against a woman who had become something more than they'd bargained for. Elira stood calmly in the doorway of her completed cabin, her father's tools floating in a protective circle around her as golden light pulsed from the structure's walls. She felt no fear, only a deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. "Protect the realm," she whispered to the ancient magic flowing through her. "But do no unnecessary harm," the first soldier. To reach the cabin's perimeter stumbled as the ground beneath his feet suddenly became uneven, roots and stones shifting to create obstacles that sent him tumbling harmlessly into a patch of soft moss. The second found his sword turning too heavy to lift as the metal itself seemed to rebel against its intended use. The third simply stopped, staring in wonder at the golden light that danced around the cabin's eaves like living starlight. Aldwin himself pressed forward despite the magical resistance, his face contorted with the rage of a man watching years of careful planning dissolve into failure. "I've conquered kingdoms," he shouted, raising both blades as he approached the cabin door. "I won't be stopped by a woman and her peasant magic." "This isn't peasant magic," Ronan said, appearing at Aldwin's flank with his own sword drawn. "This is the power that has protected our realm for 3 centuries, wielded by someone who understands service rather than conquest." The two men faced each other in the clearing, while magical energy swirled around them. The king who had chosen principle over political convenience, and the commander who would destroy everything rather than accept defeat. Their clash was inevitable, but it would be settled by steel and will rather than mystical forces. "You threw away your crown for a woman who'll never appreciate the sacrifice," Aldwin sneered, pressing his attack with the skill of decades of warfare. "I chose to serve justice rather than expedience," Ronan replied, his own blade meeting Aldwin's with ringing force. "Something you've never understood." While the two men fought, Elira focused on the larger magical working that was transforming her simple cabin into something that bridged the mortal and mystical worlds. She could feel the ancient network of protections responding to her presence, drawing strength from her conscious choice to embrace guardianship rather than flee from responsibility. The cabin's completion wasn't just about finishing construction, it was about creating a nexus where the old compact could be renewed and strengthened. As she worked her father's plane along the doorframe with smooth, meditative strokes, she felt the building settling deeper into its connection with the protective network. "Beautiful work," a voice said behind her. Elira turned to find an elderly woman watching from the forest edge, someone who moved with the fluid grace of long familiarity with these lands, despite her apparent age. There was something timeless about her, as if she belonged to the borderlands themselves, rather than any particular era. "Thank you," Elira replied, somehow unsurprised by this unexpected visitor, "though I had considerable magical assistance with the finishing touches." The woman smiled, her eyes twinkling with ancient humor. "The magic only responds to authentic intention, child. The skill and dedication had to come from you." She gestured toward the cabin's glowing walls. "This is what the founders hoped for. When they established the compact, protection maintained through love of the land, rather than duty imposed by authority." "Who are you?" "Someone who's been waiting a very long time for the guardianship to pass to worthy hands." The woman's form seemed to shimmer slightly, as if she existed only partially in the physical world. "Your father was a good steward, but he carried the responsibility as a burden. You've transformed it into something joyful." In the clearing beyond, Ronan and Aldwin's duel was reaching its climax. Both men were skilled fighters, but Ronan fought with the clarity of someone who had finally aligned his actions with his deepest convictions, while Aldwin fought with the desperate fury of someone watching his ambitions crumble. The end came suddenly. Aldwin overextended in a vicious attack that would have been lethal if it had connected, but Ronan stepped aside with the fluid grace of a natural warrior and replied with a thrust that found its mark. The Lord Commander crumpled to the ground, his weapons falling from nerveless fingers as blood spread across his pristine uniform. "It's finished," Ronan said quietly, looking down at the man who had threatened to tear the kingdom apart for personal gain. "No," Elira corrected, stepping out of her completed cabin to survey the scene. "It's beginning." The magical energy that had surrounded the construction was settling into a steady, powerful rhythm, the heartbeat of protections that would endure for generations. Her cabin stood complete and beautiful, every log fitted with precision, every joint sealed with care and magical purpose. It was exactly what she'd envisioned when she first picked up her father's axe, but transformed by forces she was only beginning to understand. The ancient woman smiled one final time before fading into the forest shadows, like mist touched by sunrise. Aldwyn's surviving soldiers had long since fled, unwilling to continue fighting for a dead commander's ambitions. The clearing was quiet, except for the soft sound of wind through completed walls and the distant song of birds welcoming the morning. Elira had built her sanctuary one log at a time, but she'd also built something much larger, a new understanding of what it meant to serve freely chosen purpose rather than imposed obligation. The cabin was complete, but the story of what she and Ronan would build together was just beginning. 6 months later, the cabin had become something extraordinary, not just in its physical presence, though the structure that rose from the borderland clearing was beautiful beyond anything Elira had originally envisioned, but in what it represented to the kingdom and beyond. Word had spread of the woman who'd claimed her magical heritage on her own terms, and of the king who'd chosen principle over political convenience. Visitors came from distant lands to see the place where ancient power had been renewed through love rather than conquest. Elira stood in the cabin's main room, running her hands along the windowsill she'd just finished smoothing with her father's plane. The wood was warm beneath her fingers, alive with the contentment of a structure that had found its perfect purpose. Through the window, she could see Ronan working in the garden they'd planted together, vegetables and herbs that would sustain them through the winter, but also flowers chosen simply because they brought joy to the eye. He'd abdicated formally 3 months ago, passing the crown to his younger brother with a ceremony that emphasized continuity and renewal rather than abandonment of duty. The kingdom had weathered the transition remarkably well, perhaps because the magical protections now burned stronger than they had in generations, and because the political crisis that had threatened to tear the realm apart had been resolved through understanding rather than force. "The delegation from the Eastern March has arrived," Ronan called from the garden, straightening from the tomato plants he'd been tending. "They seem nervous." Elira smiled, watching him walk toward the cabin with the easy stride of a man who'd found peace with his choices. The crown had aged him, but freedom had restored something essentially youthful to his bearing. They should be nervous. They're about to discover that magical guardianship can't be claimed through political marriage. The new Lord Commander of the Eastern March, Aldwyn's replacement, had been making careful overtures about renewed alliance discussions. Not through marriage proposals this time, but through genuine negotiation based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. It was a refreshing change that suggested the lessons of the previous months had reached even the most traditionally minded political leaders. A soft knock at the door interrupted her musings. Elira opened it to find Marcus, now serving as the official liaison between her household and the royal court. His weathered face bore the satisfied expression of a man who'd watched dangerous situations resolve themselves through wisdom rather than bloodshed. "Lady Elira, the delegation requests an audience at your convenience," he said formally, though his eyes twinkled with suppressed humor. "They've brought gifts, apparently hoping to curry favor with the guardian of the borderlands." The title still felt strange, though Elira was growing accustomed to the way people spoke of her role in maintaining the magical protections. She'd resisted formal recognition initially, preferring to think of herself simply as a woman who'd chosen to live where she belonged. But the responsibility came with obligations that extended beyond personal preference, and she'd learned to accept the ceremonial aspects with grace, if not enthusiasm. "What kind of gifts?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Rare woods from the eastern forests, gold for purchasing additional land, and—" Marcus paused, his expression becoming carefully neutral. "A marriage proposal for their new Lord Commander's eldest son." Elira and Ronan both burst into laughter at the absurd persistence of political tradition. Some lessons, apparently, took longer to sink in than others. "I'll receive them in an hour," Elira decided. "That should give them time to appreciate the garden and perhaps reconsider whether they really want to repeat their predecessors' mistakes." As Marcus departed to convey her message, Ronan joined her in the cabin's main room. The space had been designed for both intimate domesticity and formal reception, with furniture that could be rearranged to accommodate everything from quiet dinners to diplomatic meetings. It was a perfect reflection of their life together, private when they needed solitude, public when duty required their attention. "Another marriage proposal," he observed with amusement. "You're becoming quite the sought-after prize in political circles." "Good thing I'm already spoken for," Elira replied, moving into his arms with the natural ease of long-established affection. "Though I notice they're not offering to marry you off to secure magical alliances." "The new political order has its advantages," Ronan agreed, holding her close as afternoon light streamed through the windows they'd positioned to catch exactly this angle of sun. "No one expects former kings to enter into strategic marriages." Their own wedding had taken place in this very room 2 months ago, a ceremony that celebrated choice and partnership rather than political necessity. The rings they wore had been forged from the iron nail that Elira had driven into her cabin's first beam, transformed by magical craft into circles that represented the transformation of what had once bound into what now connected. "Do you ever regret it?" Elira asked, a question that had become ritual between them. "Giving up the crown, the power, the certainty of your place in history?" "I traded an inherited throne for a chosen life," Ronan replied, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with gentle reverence. "I traded political power for magical partnership, royal isolation for genuine love. History will have to judge whether that was wisdom or folly, but I know which choice feels right in my heart." Outside, they could hear voices as the Eastern March delegation explored the grounds, probably trying to understand how a simple cabin had become the center of magical authority that protected an entire kingdom. The answer wasn't complex, but it was difficult for political minds to grasp: power that came from belonging rather than conquest, strength that grew from service rather than dominance. As evening approached and their official duties were complete, Elira and Ronan sat on their cabin's porch, watching the sun set over the borderlands they now protected together. The magical energy that had once felt overwhelming had settled into a steady, comfortable presence, as natural as breathing, as essential as heartbeat. "What shall we build next?" Ronan asked, gesturing toward the cleared land that surrounded their home. Elira smiled, her hand finding his as she contemplated the future they were creating, one choice at a time. "Whatever we decide together," she said simply. "One log at a time, with all the time in the world to get it right." The cabin stood solid and beautiful around them, but it was no longer the end of her dreams. It was the foundation for everything they would build together in the years to come. She had escaped a life of imposed obligations to discover something far better, a life of freely chosen purpose, shared with someone who understood that the best things were always built slowly, carefully, and with love that grew stronger with each passing day. In the distance, the magical barriers that protected the kingdom hummed with contentment, anchored by two people who had learned that the strongest foundations were built not on political convenience or inherited authority, but on the bedrock of hearts that had chosen to build a life together, one careful decision at a time.